Hey everybody, this is Professor Angelo, and we're in our next installment of our podcast on early American history. This is going into chapter 9 of the Tindall and She book, as many of you remember, right? So we've just gotten through the first half of the 19th century, and there were large debates between states' rights advocates or people who were focused on their regional interests and those who were promoting nationalism and the growth of the United States as a hopefully rising international power. And so we're going to be looking into the different aspects of America as it emerges from the War of 1812. And so what we talk about now is this new rise of nationalism. And this is really part of an unexpected result or benefit that comes from the victory of the War of 1812. And part of this really has to do with what happens during the war, right? So Jefferson's embargo in 1807 had forced Americans to look inward for the production of their finished goods. Now, this is really an unintended consequence on the part of Jefferson. Jefferson did not want Americans to become a manufacturing state. He wanted us to remain a nation of virtuous farmers, or what he referred to as a Republican ideal. And so America's first industrial revolution really gets started in the early parts of the 1800s, really even to the late 1790s. And so the first Bank of the United States expired in 1811 and was not immediately renewed. And what happened, of course, is as the country went into war in 1812, this lack of financial control created economic turmoil. But more importantly, it was destabilizing, not just to the economy, but also to the government, which wanted to issue bonds in order to finance the war effort. And this becomes a very big problem. So when the war ends and Americans find themselves truly independent, if that's the proper word, we established a new sort of relationship with Britain. Now, I think it's really important to be very clear on this. This is mostly, in my opinion, coming from the British side. So the British make a decision really towards the end of the War of 1812, but certainly afterwards, that it was no longer productive to be an antagonist towards the United States, but probably better off forming some kind of an alliance. This is not a formal alliance, but this is a sense of cooperation and to play upon the shared culture of the two countries and to create what I'm going to refer to as a pacified northern Atlantic Ocean. And this decision on the part of the British really benefits us immensely because we don't have to worry about the North Atlantic. And so our eastern seaboard is, for the most part, perfectly protected territory without us having to put the full effort of a naval force to make that happen. And so as we're moving west, it's incredibly convenient to know that our eastern seaboard or our backs are being protected by the British. So this has amazing repercussions for us in terms of allowing us to grow economically and physically into the mid-1800s. Now, this newfound nationalism comes, of course, from this great victory. We get our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, out of it. We get a new, vibrantly built national capital. So in order to repair the damage from the fires that the British lit, the Americans decide to upgrade, if you will, the appearance of the capital. The executive mansion is repainted in bright, beautiful white, so it becomes the White House. The Capitol building is going to be revived, and there's going to be a conversation about doing embellishments on it, which is going to be the colonnade and the dome that will be added during the Civil War. But there's also going to be a drive towards recognition of a uniquely American culture. And we'll talk about that as we get further into this conversation. So the American system gets introduced in 1816 by Representative Henry Clay of Kentucky. And this is a very important endeavor, but I'm hoping that everybody will look at this and recognize it as very similar to Hamilton's economic plan after the American War of Independence. And that's no joke. It really is a similarity. So the first thing that happens is that Henry Clay introduces a second Bank of the United States, or what we call the BUS. And this is going to get us another 20-year charter of a bank. Now, as I stated earlier, the war really showed just how convenient it is to have a centralized financial authority, and the new industrial era also pointed to the need for it. Madison is still president at this time. He is not running in 1816. He's going to be replaced by his Secretary of State, James Monroe. However, Madison drops his reluctance and kind of adapts Jefferson's feelings that the bank was, in a sense, a quote-unquote necessary evil. There's also going to be the introduction of a protective tariff. And here again, Madison sort of steps away from other anti-federalists. Southerners were very much against a protective tariff. And that's because as agrarian societies, the South doesn't, A, benefit from the tariff because it's not helping their cause at all. And B, it results in an artificially high cost of living for Southern farmers who, let's face it, are only paid once a year. And when prices go up on imported products, they also go up on domestic products. And so for the Southern farmer, they lose no matter what. And then finally, C, there's always the chance that when we raise our tariffs against foreign countries, they raise their tariffs against our products. And the products that were being exported almost exclusively in the United States, in fact, pretty much 99% of our products being exported were agrarian products. And so Southerners were very much against it. So Madison's signature on this legislation is a unique, I'm going to call it acrobatics, because Madison himself is going to be harmed by this tariff as a Southern farmer. But Madison goes back to his Federalist roots a little bit here. And that's because Madison looks at the Constitution and he sees that a tariff is in Article 1, Section 8 as an enumerated power of the federal government, meaning only the federal government has the power to issue a tariff. So Madison's argument is going to be that since that is the case, then it is up to the Congress to decide what the rate of the tariff is going to be. The president's role is not to interfere in that. It is to simply execute the tariff. So some may see that as a cop-out, but I see that as really very Madisonian, in the sense that Madison believed in a separation of powers. He believed that in the 10th Amendment, but in this case, the tariff is specifically enumerated as a federal power, and therefore, as the president, his job is to execute the law, not legislate it. So, rather consistent. And then, finally, is something called the Internal Improvements Bill, which was called the Bonus Bill. So, the government wanted to take excess revenues that it might have on other things, or surplus revenues that come into the Treasury, and commit those to internal improvement projects, roads, canals, railroads, and to get those, or eventually railroads, not in 1816, but anyhow. This bill, however, Madison vetoes. And it's interesting to read his veto message. Madison basically agreed with the Congress that the federal government should be out there helping to build the infrastructure for the country. However, in his true Madisonian fashion, pointed out that internal improvements is not, and I repeat, not listed as an enumerated power of the federal government, as stated in Article 1, Section 8. Therefore, to Madison, the bill was unconstitutional. And so Madison encouraged the House and Senate to pass an amendment to the Constitution giving the federal government such power, and he would gladly sign it. But this is unfortunately in his lame duck period. And so Madison was on his way out of office. And so it had very little appeal to it. So now we want to march into a different category here. So we're going to have a conversation about the Marshall Court. Now, first, let's deal with terminology. Whenever you see phraseology like this, the Marshall Court, this means, or I should say, this is a reference to all the Supreme Court decisions that come down while John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So currently, John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so all the decisions that come down now are referred to as Roberts Court's decision. So the Marshall Court lasts for 34 years. Marshall is made Chief Justice in 1801 by John Adams, and he will die while in office in 1835 in the last few years of the Jackson administration. So Marshall, a devoted Federalist, is going to literally outlive his own party by a large number of years. Now, we addressed one of these issues already, and this is the Marbury versus Madison decision in 1803. And this established what we refer to as judicial review. And that's the notion that the federal government, specifically the federal courts, have final say on the constitutionality of American law. And this case is rather significant, and it not only establishes judicial review, but for many scholars, it's a sign that the federal judiciary was going to truly be a separate and independent branch of the government. And this was still somewhat unrealized at this point. So similarly, in the Martin Leslie case, the court is expanding, and this is how I do it. And if it doesn't work for you, you can find other models. But to me, what's happening is the court establishes this idea called judicial review. And then in other cases, it's basically taking that concept and applying it to other things. So in Martin v. Hunter Leslie, it's expanding the idea of judicial review. In Cohen's v. Virginia, just the fact that you see the state Virginia listed should tell you that now judicial review is being applied to state laws, right? Do state laws comply with the U.S. Constitution? And in this case, the court said, yes, it did. And then in protecting contracts, we get Dartmouth v. Woodward. So this is rather important because it ties into the early industrial revolution that was happening primarily in New England and New York. And that is, how do people engage in business? And for the most part, they do this through contractual agreements. Dartmouth had a charter that was given to it by the King of England. And it was initially for the purpose of educating Native Americans, Indians that had converted to Christianity, what New Englanders called praying Indians. So it was chartered as a private institution, and it had quickly become a prestigious private school. Well, the state of New Hampshire, which is where Dartmouth is located, wanted to make the school the University of New Hampshire, thereby making it a public school, a public university. And Dartmouth sued the state. Woodward was the Secretary of State for the state of New Hampshire. And so the attorney for Dartmouth here is Daniel Webster, one of the Immortal Trio, who was an alumnus of this group. And so the Supreme Court sided with Dartmouth, saying that states can't go around changing charters and contracts in order to meet their changing needs. This is going to be the reason why a lot of American contracts have what we call sunset clauses on it. So there's terms of the agreement. So it lasts a year, or the contract lasts 5 years, or however it's going to last. Then, in McCulloch v. Maryland, in this case, again, you see the state of Maryland. In this, the court's going to establish judicial review over state executive action. In this case, the state of Virginia or Maryland decided to tax the Federal Bank of the United States. When the Bank of the United States was reinstituted, the state of Maryland voted against it. When the bank put a branch in Baltimore, they put McCulloch in there as the president of the branch. Maryland taxed the revenues of the bank, and McCulloch sued Maryland. And the court agreed with McCulloch, stating that Maryland could not interfere with a federally instituted bank because it was a breach of a supremacy clause, basically. And this established something called dual federalism, which is going to basically maintain the relationship between state and federal institutions all the way up until the 1930s. And then we get into the regulation of interstate commerce. And the case here is Gibbons v. Ogden. And just as it's referred to as the steamboat case. And that's because Ogden had inherited or obtained the patent for the steamboat. And the state of New York had given him a monopoly sailing license, or I should say navigation license, for the Hudson River. He established a ferry service between Hoboken, New Jersey and Manhattan. Gibbons, who had a North American fishing license issued by the federal government, opened a rival ferry service in New York between those same spots. Ogden had initially sued Gibbons in a state court, and the state said that Gibbons was in violation of Ogden's monopoly license. Gibbons sued Ogden in a federal court, and the U.S. Supreme Court basically said that because Ogden's boat crossed state lines, it constituted interstate commerce, and therefore Ogden's monopoly license no longer was valid. And so this established the federal primacy over interstate commerce, which again is something that is clearly enumerated in Article 1, Section 8. So, in 1816, we have an election, and James Monroe is going to be elected very comfortably. It's a landslide vote. His opponent, Rufus King of the Federalist Party, is really badly beaten. And it is the last time the Federalist Party is going to have a national candidate. And in fact, the Federalist Party ceases to exist as a national party. We will see it as a regional party in New England, but the Federalist Party is basically done. And now, what is going on? James Monroe, as the Secretary of State, was the sort of natural choice of the party to move forward. And of course, he was victorious. He's the last of the Revolutionary War generation to serve as president. And Monroe was also a member of the First Families of Virginia. So his family were a part of the elites, going all the way back to the earliest colonial period. Many Federalists were bitter at the death of their party and the victory of yet another Virginia elite to govern over them. Monroe decided to do something that Washington had done when he was elected, and that was to go on a good world tour, predominantly of the northern states. And many people thought that this Virginia dynasty would not be a welcomed sight in New England. And some had actually stated that it would probably be better for Monroe not to show up in Boston. Now, when he does show up in Boston, a newspaper reporter noted that the celebration welcoming Monroe into Boston was so boisterous and so filled with national pride and energy. He said it was as if an era of good feelings had descended upon the people. And so Monroe's 8 years in office are referred to as the era of good feelings. Now, what I'd like you to do with this as you're reading and as you're listening to this is to think of the era of good feelings as a motif. And so on the surface, everything is going to be really positive. There's going to be strong national pride. There's going to be growing economic prosperity. There's going to be the expansion of the country as we move farther and farther west. Our national military services are going to be sort of unchallenged because of the British partnership that we form. So there's all these really cool positive things. However, if you go beneath the surface, you find that there are a number of things that were not quite right. And we're going to see those in many aspects as we go forward. And one of them is this idea of one-party rule. George Washington, in his farewell address, had said to the American people, get rid of parties. Just, you shouldn't do this, right? It's not a good thing for the country. And Monroe also advocated for this. And so here we are, one party, right? The Democratic Republicans are basically on their own at the top. And the problem with this is it tends to give the impression that there was no longer any division among politicians. And what I'd like you to do is just sort of think to yourself, if a politician or a group of politicians lose an election, do they just go home and not do anything? Of course they don't. They form a quote-unquote loyal opposition. But in this case, the opposing party was dead. Well, what's going to happen is that Federalists who still wanted to be part of the political process are simply going to join the Democratic Republican Party. But in so doing, they're going to create fractionalization within that party. And we'll see how this comes up over and over again. But essentially, a caucus within the Democratic Republicans will form called the National Republicans. Now, the other aspect of early politics is this idea of what we call King Caucus. So a caucus is a political meeting of people of like-mindedness or similar agendas. And so at this particular period of time, ever since George Washington, party leaders had met secretly to discuss and choose who their candidates would be for various elections. This was particularly true of presidential elections. And so in this context, your name really didn't matter as much as your resume and your party loyalty. So James Monroe was a perfect resume for the presidency. He had served 8 years as the Secretary of State. He knew both the foreign and the domestic policies of the government. As the Secretary of State, he handled all of the personnel issues for the government. So he was uniquely qualified to move forward. He had also been a war hero. He served in the Revolution under George Washington. He had been a diplomat, been a part of a number of very important diplomatic agreements and treaty negotiations. And so he was a natural fit for this task. However, whether or not it was a good feeling is really a matter of conjecture and speculation. Because, yep, on the surface things were great, but there's still something not quite right. And the first indication that that might be the case was something referred to as the Panic of 1819. Now, panics are economic collapses that happen approximately every 20 years. This is still kind of true, and they're unique to market economies. Now, what you do here, if you haven't taken your econ classes yet, is think of a little squiggly line, the ups and downs of the marketplace, where the ups are booms and the bottoms are bust periods. And so the panic got its name because people who are engaged in speculation try to have their monies in various assets. And when one of those assets starts to lose its value, investors like to go to their other assets and sell those in order to make up for losses in their portfolio. This is still rather pretty common practice. Now, the problem in a panic is that banks participate in these same forms of speculation. And so the problem arises when investors are losing money, they go to the bank to get other assets, only to find out that the banks had been speculating in those same assets and therefore don't have money on hand to meet their demands. And so they panic, hence the name. Well, this panic in 1819 showed that the American monetary and fiscal system and financial system really weren't very strong and had a sort of, I'll just say like a lack of credibility in the marketplace. And so land speculation that had started to spike after the War of 1812 was leading to speculation and creating instability in the marketplace. And so we get a sign right away, something's not quite right. So the next thing that happens is the Missouri Compromise. In 1820, the territory of Missouri has met all of the requirements for statehood. They had 60,000 people, they drafted a constitution, and they submitted it to the Congress for approval. Now, the problem was that Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. Now, there are a number of issues at play here. If you can remember, the Northwest Ordinance specifically outlawed slavery, and the rationale that Jefferson made for this was that the Northwest Territory was a federally owned land, and its purpose was to break that up into territories that would then become states with full and equal sovereignty of the other states. And because it was owned initially by a federal government, that it should reflect the federal consensus, which at the time, in 1780s, basically was that slavery was going to fall out of practice, that it was not a sustainable institution, and more importantly, it fell contrary to the ideals of American democracy. Now, the cotton gin, however, had led to an amazing growth in cotton production. And in fact, cotton land speculation for cotton production was really a main contributor to the Panic of 1819. So Northerners became upset that a new state that's coming from the that's coming from the Louisiana Purchase, which of course was purchased by federal money, not state, was now going to be allowed to have slavery in it. More importantly, there was a what they refer to in the text as a balance of power in the Senate. Now, the Senate operates under different rules from the House. And in the Senate, in order for any major piece of legislation to be debated, there has to be something called a cloture vote. Now, at the time, in the 1800s, that was a 2/3 majority. Well, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, which meant 22 senators from the North and 22 senators from the South. And so this meant that any laws, any bills proposed dealing with legislation could never get really to the floor because there was no way to get 2/3 of either side to concede to allow the issue to be debated. This reality created, let's say, a temporary peace in the government. Since nothing could really be debated about slavery, we could all avoid the issue and therefore keep the country together, even though there was this very stark divide between North and South over the issue. Now, Representative Talmadge of Pennsylvania decided to put forward an amendment. This amendment was added by the House of Representatives before it was sent to the Senate for a debate. Now, this amendment essentially said that Missouri would be allowed to enter the Union as a slave state. However, it could not have slavery in its constitution. It could not import any new slaves. Their current slaves would be slaves for the rest of their lives, but the slaves' children would be emancipated at the age of 25, therefore gradually eliminated slavery from the state of Missouri. Well, this bill had absolutely no chance of being debated in the Senate. And so there's a deadlock. And so we get what's referred to as the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. And again, it's dealing with this balance of the Senate. So this stalemate gets broken really in two ways. First, the state of Maine is going to be created as a free state. Now, Maine had, since the colonial period, been connected to the colony of Massachusetts, and then, of course, the state of Massachusetts. But it had long had enough people to be its own state. So Maine's petition to be separated from Massachusetts was honored, and now we were going to have balance in the Senate again. So we'll have 12 free states and 12 slave states. In addition to it, the southern border of Missouri, which is 36 degrees 30 minutes on a parallel, would be, in a sense, a new demarcation point. Any territory north of 36 degrees 30 minutes would become a free state, and any states below 36 degrees 30 minutes would be allowed to become a slave state. Now, if you look at this map, you're probably thinking to yourself that the South was pretty stupid. That if you look at this line that goes across, this is the northern border that you see there of the Arkansas Territory. You could probably sit there and think to yourself, well, look at all that land north of it. All that's going to be free. That's pretty stupid. Couple things to remember. First and foremost, Zebulon Pike had called all of that unorganized territory the Great American Desert. A lot of people believe that that was never going to be settled by white Europeans, that it was just too desolate, no trees, no real consistent rainfall. And so a lot of people believed it was never going to be settled. So most Southerners were under the impression that those would never be states, and therefore an easy decision to make as far as going forward. So we get the admission of Missouri as a slave state. But is that truly a demarcation line? And is that really going to settle the issue? In other words, are you just pushing the problem into the future? And in many ways we were, because everybody was so happy that there was a compromise, that we're all going to move forward, that nobody really stopped to think, except for a handful of people like John Quincy Adams, who is the Secretary of State for James Monroe, is going to write in his own diaries how he engaged in conversations with a number of people, both in and out of the cabinet, to really try to get a grip of this idea, because to Adams, John Quincy Adams, this was a Band-Aid on a very major problem, and it needed to be settled, and it wasn't being settled. So again, we reach a turning point where we consciously make a decision, and there's no other way to put this. We consciously decide as a democracy to sustain the institution of slavery. There's literally no other way to do this. We decide to keep slavery alive. And we did it through government legislation. So when we talk about slavery, and I've mentioned this before, there's a tendency to think of it as a quote-unquote Southern problem. But as you just see here with this compromise bill, this is a national disgrace. This is a decision on the part of the United States of America to sustain an institution that is, quite frankly, unsustainable and certainly unjustifiable. So, let's talk about John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State. Now, Adams has an incredibly unique background. If you ever want to feel like you are a total loser and have never accomplished anything, study the biography of John Quincy Adams. So for John Adams, his background is so unique. Obviously, being the son of a former president does make a difference. However, I think it's interesting to look into his background. Again, you'll feel, I always do, whenever I read his stuff, I always think, God, I'm such a loser because I've never done anything. And when he was a child, he and his mom actually watched the Battle of Bunker Hill during the American Revolution. When his dad was sent to France during the war to negotiate an alliance with France, he took his son, who I want to say is like maybe 12, and he sails to France with his dad, and he already knew how to speak French, and his dad didn't know how to speak French, so he had to help teach his dad how to speak French, and his dad gave him lessons in Latin. Right? So when George Washington was president, he was named ambassador to the Netherlands. And then he becomes ambassador to Russia. I mean, this guy has all this background. It's unreal. It's ridiculous. He's going to be a senator. He's going to be a representative. He's going to have all these different roles. And so Adams is really uniquely qualified. And he is considered one of the most successful secretaries of state in the history of the United States. And it really bodes well on this map that you see it. So first is Rush-Bagot, which basically neutralized the Great Lakes. So there was a dispute as to where things stood, and there were forts that were armed with cannon. Rush-Bagot split some of the most of the Great Lakes between the United States and British Canada, with the exception of Lake Michigan. And then both sides agreed to not fortify any of their installations on the Great Lakes. And so we get the beginnings of the largest unfortified border between two countries. A year later, at the Convention of 1818, also called the Red River Basin Treaty, the United States and Britain agreed to extend or I should say, settle the border dispute over the Louisiana Territory. And this is between Lake of the Woods and the Rocky Mountains. And we settled at the 49th degree parallel. And then we also agreed to joint occupation of Oregon country. Now, this map that you're looking at doesn't give it quite justice. What you have to do is you have to look at that map, look at Oregon country as it states here, and then imagine that boundary actually goes all the way up to the southern border of Alaska, so incorporating all of present-day British Columbia. So it was a very large piece of real estate. In the following year, Adams turns his attention to Spain. And now we're going to look at the border between the United States and Spanish America. And here we see Adams being unbelievably crafty. He looks at the reality on the ground and he notices that the Spanish are having problems holding on to their possessions. Now, the Spanish crown had been taken over during the Napoleonic Wars. And so only after the Congress of Vienna did the Spanish monarchy get control of its country again. And so the Spanish were trying very hard to reimpose total control over their colonies in the New World. And they were meeting a lot of resistance. Adams knew this, and he took advantage of it. And so what he does is he negotiates a favorable condition that incorporates something called the Purchase of Florida. So if you can look on this map, you'll see that Florida actually was two separate colonies, East Florida and West Florida. West Florida basically incorporated part of the present-day panhandle of Florida and the southern tips of Alabama and Missouri. And so the United States claimed this, and so did Spain. And there's a lot of back and forth going on. And what happens is in 1819, the United States gets fed up with a number of incursions by Seminole Indians and I should say runaway slaves. And so this becomes a very big crisis for the United States government. So what happens in 1819 is, out of, I guess, sheer frustration that the Spanish were not able to control these marauding groups of people, James Monroe decides to send the United States Army to chase after these renegade groups of people that were basically shooting Americans and rampaging through American settlements. And so the commander of U.S. forces at the time was Andrew Jackson. And so Jackson was given the orders to go into the Spanish Floridas to find these criminals and essentially bring them back to face justice. Now, as we'll find out in Chapter 10, Andrew Jackson's not exactly the man of tact and diplomacy. He is really the Donald Trump of the 1800s. And he goes into the Floridas and quite literally goes on a rampage. He shoots people. He executes British citizens that were operating in the area without a trial. He actually captures St. Mark's, which is, I believe, the capital of West Florida. And he really just wreaks havoc. The Secretary of War for James Monroe was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And Calhoun is so outraged, he tells Monroe that he should recall General Jackson and have him court-martialed and for dereliction of duty. Adams, as Secretary of State, has everybody calm down and says, "Leave it to me, I will handle it." And the way I look at this is Adams kind of plays a good cop, bad cop thing with the Spanish. And it's also referred to as the Adams Onus Treaty. Onís is the Spanish foreign minister. And in his communications, Adams basically says to him, "Listen, I know we have a dispute." And the first had to deal with, I don't know if you can see this arrow, but this little area of East Texas. And there was a dispute as to where exactly that border was. Now, the Spanish claimed that it went all the way up to that river that you see there, the Sabine. The Americans believed that the original river went all the way, or I should say, the original boundary actually started at the bay at what is currently called Corpus Christi, Texas, which is significantly south of there. Adams agreed to give the Spanish, or I should say, to concede to the Spanish claim, which makes Adams very unpopular among Southerners. And we get what's called the Transcontinental Treaty Line, or the Adams-Onis Line, which, as you can see, operates like a big staircase going across the United States. And it starts on the 42nd degree parallel, which is the northern boundary between California and Oregon, and goes all the way down and gives Spain a favorable treaty line. And in exchange for that, Adams offers to buy the Floridas from Spain, thereby eliminating the problem. And the Spanish agree to it because they believe that they could use, I believe it was something like $10 million or whatever. It may have only been $5 million, but they thought that they could use that money to better control their situation there, or help finance their situation in the New World. The next big feature comes from what's referred to as the Monroe Doctrine 1823. And this has to do with what is essentially Americans' preference for the Western Hemisphere to be free of European influences. Now, there is a number of things that are going on here, but essentially, European powers that had for a very long time been focused on defeating Napoleon now felt that they could redirect their attentions and their energies and their militaries towards the New World. Many of them, like Spain, already had colonies, but they were slowly losing their influence over them. Something called the Bolivarian Revolution. Simón de Bolívar had rose up in South America. The Mexicans had started to rise up against the Spanish. And many Europeans were either in alliance with Spain to help them keep control, or wanted to take advantage of Spanish weakness and carve out colonies for themselves. The United States found that very troubling, as did Britain. Now, the reason why the British were upset is that during the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy had come in and established trading sites with Spanish and even French and Portuguese settlers. And they were worried that when Spain reestablished itself and other European powers tried to expand, that the British influence in the area would diminish. So the British actually first proposed this idea, but it's Adams who drafts it, and he convinces President Monroe to issue the policy unilaterally rather than do it jointly with the British. And this pisses off the British a lot. But basically, the Monroe Doctrine had three main elements. If you're a European power and you did not already have colonies in the New World, you had to stay out. Second, if you had colonies in the New World, you could not expand them. And then finally, the United States would agree to stay out of Eastern Hemisphere affairs. Right? In other words, the United States would stay out of European balance of powers wars and would stay out of all these different Asia issues and everything. We would just stay out. And this becomes basically the modus operandi of American foreign policy for almost the next 100 years. And so the United States basically is making this gesture. Now, on the surface, this can seem like the United States defending this, the new republics that are emerging, and that's not really quite the case. If you read John Quincy Adams's diaries, which I don't recommend, but if you had to, you would see that John Quincy Adams and others are seeing the United States as the natural inheritors of any of these lands that are relinquished by European powers. In other words, when the Spanish possessions that you see on that map all of a sudden become non-Spanish possessions, Adams wanted the United States to be positioned to move in and take advantage of those power vacuums. And that's really what goes on. For the most part, Virtually no European power besides Britain even realizes that the policy is being issued. But the British Navy will basically help enforce that policy after 1823. The only treaty that really emerges out of this is the Russo-American Treaty, and this is the last one negotiated under John Quincy Adams as the Secretary of State. Now, here again, Adams is uniquely qualified. He had been ambassador of the United States to Russia. His daughter died of scarlet fever while they were there, and his daughter was and still is buried there. And the Tsar of Russia was really close in age, and they had actually built I'm not going to call it a close friendship, but they were very fond of each other and had a good relationship with each other, right? John Quincy Adams and the Tsar of Russia. And so there was already very comfortable relationship. So Russia had fur trapping settlements in the western United States, and it stretched all the way from the Bering Strait all the way down into present-day Northern California. And so the Russians were a part of this, let's call it a chess game between the United States, Britain, and Russia and Spain as to who's going to have control over that area. The Russians decide to relinquish their claims to those territories, but the United States agreed that any territory north of 54 degrees 40 minutes was going to be Russian possession. And so we get what's called Russian America, or what we today call Alaska. So if you see here, the propaganda that's going to be used, right, in order to justify basically being very cruel towards Native Americans. And so this was something that is dated in the 1830s, but it's depicting what's going on at the time that Jackson invaded Florida. And this is basically a very Americanized, let's call it, narrative to essentially justify what was really a violation of international law. Here's John Quincy Adams. He's the first president to be photographed, I believe, while in office. This is what we call a daguerreotype. Now, as I talked earlier, the caucus system had been in place, and John Quincy Adams was very uniquely qualified to take over the presidency. 8 years as Secretary of State. He had served in the House of Representatives at this point. He had been the ambassador to the Netherlands, Spain, and Russia. He had been at the negotiations. He was actually a secretary for his dad at the negotiations of the Peace Treaty of Paris that ended the War of American Independence. He was a major negotiator on the team for the Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812. So this is a guy who is literally in the middle of everything. This man lived at Mount Vernon when George Washington was alive and spent like a few weeks there. He had spent weeks at Monticello with Thomas Jefferson. I mean, this is a guy who literally knew Benjamin Franklin, right? I mean, this is a guy who was just really well connected and had an amazing resume bringing him to this point. And so he was a natural choice. But if you remember, we have just one party. But the party had two factions. There was a faction called the National Republicans that supported more Federalist philosophy. And then there were the traditional Democratic Republicans who just called themselves the Democratic Caucus. And these two groups could not agree on a nominee for president. They all agreed on the vice presidential nominee, the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. However, they could not agree on a presidential nominee. And so the two sides each nominated two people. The National Republicans nominated John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. And the Democrats nominated William Crawford, who at the time was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Andrew Jackson, who was the commanding general of U.S. forces. And so the election of 1824 is known as the corrupt bargain. Now, this leads to Adams as the presidency, right? And so what happens is the election goes through. Andrew Jackson takes the popular vote. But as we all know, popular votes don't make presidents. So Andrew Jackson wins there. He also gets the most electoral votes, but he did not get the required half in order to be president. So the vote went to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay, who was in fourth place, was the Speaker of the House. And he came out and publicly endorsed Adams for the presidency. And Adams is voted by the House to win the presidency, even though he got second place in the popular vote and second place in the Electoral College. Now, when Adams is announced as the president, he nominates Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. Now, as you've probably figured out by now, there's a bit of a trend developing. Thomas Jefferson was Washington's Secretary of State. Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State. Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams was Monroe's Secretary of State. And now Adams has named Clay as Secretary of State. The Jackson supporters called it a corrupt bargain. And this really damages Adams's time as president. In fact, he's considered one of the worst presidents of American history. And it's largely because of this caucus system that, in a sense, shoves nominees down the throats of voters. The other element here is the rise of the Democrat Party, but also of a more democratic electorate. So in the period of time that we're talking about, which is the 1820s, many states had started to drop the property requirements for voting. And so more and more adult white males who had never voted before were now being allowed to participate in American democracy. And when they realize that they don't really get a say in who is nominated, it frustrated them. And because they had voted overwhelmingly for Jackson, many of them could not understand why Jackson wasn't made the president. And this fed into this idea of government being an elitist, conspiratorial system. And so now, this creates a problem. John Quincy Adams was a member of the Democratic Republican Party. However, he was a nationalist. He had Federalist philosophy. And he wanted this new administration to embark on major national programs. And it was a disaster. And it forces the Democrats to break away. So in 1826, Andrew Jackson is going to form a separate party called the Democrat Party. John C. Calhoun, who was already the vice president of the United States, joins the Democrats. And so we get the similar situation that John Quincy Adams' father found himself in, where John Adams was the president as a Federalist, and his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, was an anti-Federalist. Here, John Quincy Adams, is the president of the United States with nationalist philosophy or Federalist philosophy, and John C. Calhoun, the vice president, had anti-Federalist philosophy. And this comes to a head in the Tariff of 1828, just 4 years later. Calhoun has already agreed to be the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, so for the opposite party. Also, as the vice president, he's the president of the Senate, which means he breaks all tie votes. Calhoun plays a swift little move here. He thinks that the tariff is unpopular both in the South and in New England, and he convinces himself that if he allows for a tariff to come up onto the legislative agenda, John Quincy Adams would come out in favor of it, which would result in him losing votes in the South and in New England, which would then result in the Democrats winning the election. The nominee for the Democratic Party in 1828 was Andrew Jackson, so it's going to be a rematch. John C. Calhoun makes a number of miscalculations. The first is what I just said there. He thinks that introducing a tariff would force Adams to take a stand that would be unpopular. Now, he also believed that if Jackson becomes president, because he had no experience in government and was in fact in Jackson's mind functionally illiterate and not really a gentleman, that he, the vice president, Calhoun, would basically be the power behind the throne, that he would, in a sense, be running the country, and Jackson would be this sort of like hero figurehead. And so he tries to connive this little tariff, but in reality, it ends up passing. And Calhoun decides to write what's called the Tariff of Abomination, or the South Carolina Exposition Protest, and it's a big, huge kerfuffle. But Adams now finds himself incredibly unpopular, and Jackson is able to not only win the popular vote but the Electoral College. It's a landslide. And so what we see here is a major change in American politics and the introduction of something called populism. And so by the time we get to 1828, all the states in the Union had eliminated property requirements. And so Jackson becomes the first president elected under what's called universal white male suffrage. As long as you were 21 and white and a male, you could vote. And so literally millions upon millions of people are going to participate. And Jackson's election is seen as a major changing and shift in American politics. So as you can see here, Adams did not fare very well. 178 electoral votes to 83. The popular vote was actually a lot more close. And that reflects really the fact that in New England and in other sections of the eastern seaboard, a lot of people feared Andrew Jackson's rise to power because he was, in fact, not part of the established ruling elite. And so that brings us to the end of this segment. And when we get back together again, we'll be talking about Andrew Jackson as president. So hopefully everything's going well, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.